They called him by many names. Some called him Berhai, the shark. Others called him Berlive, the lion. But his men called him Uncle Karl for a long time, partly because, even though he seemed distant, sometimes untouchable, he was extremely humane toward his subordinates, especially toward those who faced the sea, knowing that leaving the harbor could have meant never returning home again. But toward the end of the war, they would start calling him something else. They would start calling him Papa Dönitz, partly because of that paternal spirit, and partly because that man had sacrificed to the sea perhaps the most precious thing, the only two sons he had from his marriage. This is the story of a solitary man, a wolf, a sea wolf, but also a politician, of a man displaying tactical genius and some say inhumanity. This is the story of the Gross Admiral Papa Dönitz, the father of the U-boats. Born into a German family before the end of the 19th century, Karl Dönitz was, you could say, always a man of the sea. Ever since, as a young cadet, he boarded the first ships of the Oxaflot and then the cruiser, then the Breslau. We are at the dawn of the Great War, the First World War, and the young Karl Dönitz is on board this ship, the Breslau, which is escorting a larger ship, the battle cruiser Goebbels. They are the core of the Mediterranean squadron of the Kaiserliche Kriegsmarine, the war navy of Kaiser Wilhelm. They are the ships Goebbels and Breslau. They give rise to an episode we could say almost epic, a chase across the Mediterranean, in which they are not the hunters, but the prey. They have British and French ships on their tail, yet they manage to evade the entire combined Allied naval force. And they take refuge in Istanbul, at the time actually part of, in fact, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The very arrival of those two ships in the Sea of Marmara and the Bosphorus, together with the seizure in England of the ships ordered by the Sultan himself, would become the casus belli that pushed the Sublime Porte to side with the Central Powers, that is, Imperial Germany and Austria-Hungary. Deleuze, however, does not spend much time aboard the Breslau, which, along with the Goebbels, is incorporated into the Ottoman fleet and even changes its name. No, he is sent back to Germany, even though many of his fellow soldiers agree to wear the Ottoman uniform and fight in the Black Sea against the Tsarist ships. He returns to his homeland, and from that moment on, he begins to take an interest in what everyone considers the weapon of the future. About the war at sea, the submarine weapon, in which Germany has invested a lot and which becomes something essential to try to win the war at sea. After the Battle of Jutland in 1916 basically ended in a stalemate, but it forces the Kaiser's high seas fleet to stay in port and never go out in force again. Submarines, on the other hand, are different. Submarines are used and used more and more constantly, even though, in the end, it will also be because of them. If the United States enters the First World War, providing that contribution of energy, men, and resources necessary to help the Allied powers win the war. When the war ends, Dönitz has already reached a mid-level rank among the officers, but he does not take part in the mutiny. The sailors' mutiny, which leads to the November Revolution that overthrows the Kaiser and proclaims the Republic, thus practically bringing the Great War to an end. He still remains among the officers and begins to specialize more and more in the submarine force. According to Karl Dönitz, the submarine can become increasingly important in the context of naval warfare. It's not only his career period, but also his personal relationships. Karl Dönitz marries a wife, a woman named Ingeborg Weber, the daughter of General Erich Weber, a daughter of the High Prussian nobility, we could say, and from her, he has 3 children, a daughter, Ursula, who was born in 1917 and lived a long life. She died in 1990 at the age of 83. And then 2 sons, Peter and Klaus. They won't have an easy life nor a long one, but we'll see more about that later. With the rise of Nazism, Karl Dönitz saw the possibility for Germany to rearm in a concrete way, a rearmament that had already become evident during the final phase of the Weimar Republic with the launch of the Deutschland, the first of the so-called pocket battleships. It's a sign of rebirth, some say revanchism, meaning the desire to seek revenge against the Treaty of Versailles, which in Germany was experienced as a very harsh diktat, a diktat that, among other things, forbids Germany from developing a submarine weapon, a diktat that is soon circumvented. Karl Dönitz himself increasingly pushes to strengthen that submarine weapon. And when Hitler comes to power, Dönitz decides to embrace the Nazi cause, mainly to develop U-boats. He talks about it first of all with Hermann Göring, the future Marshal of the Reich, who within the Nazi government also has a role in the development of industry. He is the head of the 4-year Plan Office, a plan aimed at heavily rearming Germany, although it must be said that the Kriegsmarine receives only 13% of the budget allocated for armaments. Very little. Not just Dönitz, but also an opponent. His name is Erich Raeder, Grand Admiral, Gross Admiral, and Commander-in-Chief of the fleet. Raeder has other ideas. Raeder wants a Kriegsmarine of the highest quality. He knows that the quantity pursued during the Kaiser's policy with the old minister, von der Pitz, is not a standard of comparison against England. Everyone in Germany knows it's inevitable. Dönitz expects 1942, but Hitler will act sooner. There will be a war against England, including at sea, where England has dominated for centuries, and it must use new methods. Well, while Dönitz believes in the submarine weapon, Raeder wants a Kriegsmarine based not on many ships, but on a fleet capable of keeping the Royal Navy in check. The Royal Navy, which at that time was mainly made up of old refurbished ships with an excellent crew but still of old design. Raeder, on the other hand, comes up with a very ambitious plan, which is not based only on the Panzerschiff, the pocket battleships we've already talked about. No, he starts thinking about the creation of a new class of heavy cruisers, the Hipper class, then to the Scharnhorst class battle cruisers, and finally to the Bismarck class battleships, and maybe even an aircraft carrier, the one that should have been the Graf Zeppelin, but which never entered service for many reasons, including the hostility of Göring, who was not in favor of providing his own aircraft for a force outside the Luftwaffe. Dönitz, as noted, is a strong supporter of submarines, to the point that in January 1939, he publishes a book titled U-Boot als Waffe, which means the submarine weapon. What's in this book? The principles that will form the basis of Dönitz's naval tactics are outlined. The principle of Rudeltaktik, the pack tactic, which later became known as the Wolfpack, a night combat tactic that would prove deadly against Allied convoys. It doesn't take long for Dönitz to gain Hitler's favor, and not just because Dönitz is deeply anti-Semitic, but he would never be involved in the tragedy of the Holocaust. The real reason why Karl Dönitz gains Hitler's favor happens in October 1939, about a month after the start of the war in Europe. On October 1, 1939, Karl Dönitz is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the submarines, Befehlshafer der Unterseeboote. A few days later, on the night of October 13-14, 1939, Dönitz achieves his first major success. The result? Because that night, Commander Günther Prien, in command of the U-47, accomplishes a feat that, until then, seemed impossible. Günther Prien manages to penetrate the Bay of Scapa with his submarine, in the Orkney Islands, the main base of the British home fleet, and he sinks the battleship Royal Oak with his torpedoes. It's an event that makes history and, above all, creates a lot of propaganda and boosts morale in Germany. Also because in just a couple of months, the Kriegsmarine will have to suffer a setback, the sinking of the Graf Spee off Montevideo. But we'll talk about this later in another one of our videos. From that moment on, so from October 1939, Dönitz became increasingly important within the Nazi organization. He pressured Göring to further increase the construction of submarines, which had absolute priority in German naval shipyards. Submarine bases were also developed in occupied France, and orders were given to the commanders to change tactics. No more isolated actions. In packs, like wolves in the woods or on frozen plains, wolves that gather in packs and attack at night. The tactic. The Rudeltaktik involves squadrons of submarines surrounding at night the convoys that are vital for Great Britain. Those convoys that come from America bring not only weapons, but also food supplies to Great Britain. Surround these steamships, launch torpedoes simultaneously, then quickly surface and attack the ships with the deck gun. This tactic becomes deadly. It is refined more and more, and at first the Allies don't know how to react. They endure repeated losses until something changes. It doesn't happen that at Bletchley Park in England, a group of scholars, led by the scientist and mathematician Alan Turing, fails to build a machine called Ultra, also called the bomb capable of decrypting Enigma, the code used by the Germans for all their military communications. To tell the truth, Karl Dönitz at some point thinks that something is not going right. He fears that the Allies have managed to penetrate the secrets of Enigma, and for this very reason he insists on modifying the German cipher machine, removing one of the rotors, thus adopting a 4-rotor machine to encrypt communications. But after a few months, the Allies figure out the trick and go back to reading all the communications. The Wolfpack grows increasingly ineffective because the English understand. They know where the Germans position themselves for ambushes. They avoid them, or they send escort ships to engage the submarines. Dönitz is the only one in official German documents to complain about these problems. No one believes his theories, according to which the Allies would have cracked the Enigma code. The Germans will never understand the mistake they made, and they will only discover it several decades after the end of the war, when the secret of Ultra will be revealed to the world. But in the meantime, Karl Dönitz is engaged on a front, that of the Battle of the Atlantic. Why do those convoys need to be destroyed? The German strategic victory depends on it. The only way to defeat England is not through a pitched naval battle, in which Germany would be doomed from the start. No, the only way is to starve the English people, to make survival impossible for them unless they agree to a negotiated peace. In 1941, a sort of undeclared war begins between Germany and the United States. They guarantee it with various measures, for example, the Lend-Lease Act, Lend-A, loans and leases, a constant flow of supplies to Great Britain, supplies that are also escorted by the United States Navy, with which the German U-boats occasionally clash. The war will become obvious, of course, after Pearl Harbor, after December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked. Time, a few days. When Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, the conflict becomes truly global from that moment. From then on, the fierce sea confrontation turns ruthless. Initially, everything was in favor of Karl Dönitz and his men, determined men, well-trained men, to the point that a U-boat even manages to enter New York Harbor without causing any damage. It's mainly a psychological move. A way to make the Americans understand that the Germans, with their submarines, can go wherever they want and strike whatever they want, whenever they want. But it won't last long. It will only last a few months until the Allies develop a new technique that involves a different tactic. And the adoption of escort carriers, including the so-called MEC, that is, merchant ships converted with a flight deck to host a few aircraft on deck, but which are specifically used to locate and destroy submarines. With this new tactic, the Allies shift the balance of power, causing U-boat losses to mount. Dönitz is eventually forced to recall the surviving crews from the Battle of the Atlantic as losses become unsustainable. On January 30, 1943, Dönitz is promoted to Grand Admiral and replaces his old enemy, Erich Raeder, who is retired. Raeder will still harbor significant envy toward his rival, but despite what everyone expects, even a radical change of strategy by Karl Dönitz, the new supreme commander at sea, while Dönitz continues to rely on surface ships. at least until a certain date. A date that is December 26, 1943, the day of the Battle of North Cape, the day when the British battleship Duke of York sinks, in fact, in that battle, the last major confrontation between large surface ships on the European front, the battle cruiser. From then on, by order of Dönitz and Hitler, the major German ships will stay in port and won't be scrapped. Dönitz opposes scrapping for a simple reason. The so-called principle of the flitting being, that is, keeping some ships active in the ports, to induce their opponent not to attempt any forceful actions, a complicated game of chess at a distance, keeping the ships, even if they won't set sail, but with the threat of using them. Meanwhile, more and more freedom is given to submarines and lighter vessels, and it is precisely with submarines and lighter vessels that Dönitz loses his sons, whose names are Peter and Klaus. Peter is killed on May 19, 1943. He is aboard the U-954. The U-954 is on a hunting mission, but it is intercepted by an Allied destroyer and is sunk. No one survives depth charges. A steel bar that sinks to the ever colder bottom of the North Atlantic. Even though Dönitz doesn't show emotions in public, those who know him well know that he is devastated by this loss. The second son, Klaus, who had chosen to become a ship's doctor, is made to disembark. It's a privilege for war families. If one of the sons of other officers perishes, the other male children, he disembarks and is not allowed to re-embark. However, he manages to do so on May 13, 1944, when he boards. On a torpedo boat, Klaus and his crew are supposed to go on a raid on a port in Brittany. He will not reach his destination. By the way, it was his birthday. The torpedo boat will be intercepted offshore and sunk, again with the loss of the entire crew. The second great sorrow for Karl Dönitz, who from that moment on is called by his subordinates Papa Dönitz, partly to console him, partly to make him understand that he hasn't lost only his blood sons. So far, he has lost many sons, the sailors who died under his command, but there are still many of his sons, even if not directly his own, still ready to fight, and it will continue until spring 1945. Even by using the new weapons, the new electric submarines, which are actually very few, but they pave the way for a new way of fighting. On April 30th, 1945, Karl Dönitz makes another leap in his career, perhaps not wanted, since Hitler had named him his successor as president of the Reich just days before committing suicide. First, Goering. Ousted, dismissed, arrested. Why did they betray? One, because he tried to seize power while Hitler was still alive. The other, because he secretly started separate peace negotiations with the Allies. After Hitler's death, Goering is freed by his guards and Himmler is on the run. Dönitz becomes the new head of the Reich. He will remain so for about 20 days. On May 8, 1945, his government, based in Flensburg, a city near the old border with Denmark, signs the peace with the Allies. Keitel and Jodl are the ones who sign. On May 23, 1945, the whole Dönitz cabinet, led by the head of state. Exactly. The Gross Admiral is arrested by the Allies. Dönitz is not charged with crimes against humanity. In fact, he is the only one among the major defendants at Nuremberg who does not have that charge against him. Serious, disgraceful, plotted for genocide. Even though he was a convinced anti-Semite, there is no evidence that Karl Dönitz participated in the Holocaust. He always focused solely on naval warfare. He remained stained by anti-Semitism because of speeches he made in public, speeches denigrating Jews. He stopped with words. Dönitz never took action. The accusation is that he promoted a sort of underwater terrorism. He never cared about the distinction between civilian ships and military ships. A serious accusation, but unexpectedly, a statement in his favor comes from Nuremberg. It is made by the American Admiral Chester Nimitz, the winner of the Pacific War. What does Nimitz say? Yes, it's true, the Germans adopted an indiscriminate submarine warfare tactic, but the Americans in the Pacific did the same against the Japanese, and it worked. So can you call guilty those who adopted a brutal but necessary tactic for carrying out the war? On Admiral Dönitz's case, the Allied judges discussed for a long time, and in the end, they opt for a sentence of 10 years in prison. Dönitz's former superior and old enemy, Erich Raeder, is sentenced to life in prison in Spandau together with Rudolf Hess and Walter Funk. Raeder and Funk will be released for health reasons, leaving only Hess to serve his sentence until the end. Dönitz's dad, Uncle Karl the Shark, the Lion. He is released in October 1956 and basically retires to private life. He begins writing and publishes 2 books. The first, 10 Years and 20 Days, covers 2 periods of his life: the 10 years in service of Nazi Germany and the 20 days. A dying nation. It's a dry writing style, also critical, that doesn't deny what happened, but admits its own responsibilities. Then there's a second book, less well-known, My Changing Life. It deals with that period between the 2 wars, in which Karl Dönitz realized the need to pursue a career, but he also raised his children. Those children for whom he had a deep love and who were taken from him by the war. Karl Dönitz dies of a heart attack. On Christmas Eve of 1980, at the age of 89, he is buried a few days later, on Epiphany Day of 1981. At his funeral, not only kings and leaders of the Second World War are present, not only some officers of the Bundeswehr, but also officers from the navies of half of Europe are present, who have come to pay tribute to the old lion. German law? Since he is a former war criminal and also a former Nazi, those attending the funeral are not to display uniforms or military decorations. It was a price to pay, but that day as they buried the coffin in a completely unremarkable, very simple grave, the English, French, Americans, and Italians all decided to pay tribute to that man, that tough yet kind man, that determined man. But he also knew how to be moved, the man who revolutionized underwater warfare and took responsibility, that man whom many called Uncle Karl, whom even more called Papa Dönitz, and who for everyone will remain Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz.